This is the Biocentury Show. The Biocentury Show is brought to you by the 10th China Healthcare Summit. For a decade, Biocentury, Bay Helix, and Insights partner McKinsey & Company have organized a healthcare summit for biopharma and medtech leaders to discuss cross-border collaboration, investment, and the bridge to innovation in China. For our 10th anniversary, we return to Shanghai to resume in-person networking, live panels, and debate. Join us November 2nd and 3rd for a program designed for C-level executives and investors.
Hello, I'm Steve Usden, Washington editor of Biocentury, and I'm speaking today with John Crowley, executive chairman at Amicus Therapeutics. In late September, FDA approved Amicus's Pombiliti plus Opfolda combination to treat late-onset Pompe disease. The company has one other approved product, Galafold, to treat Fabry disease. Pompe and Fabry are very rare diseases that, untreated, are always fatal. John's vice chair of Bio, the Biotech Industry's trade association, and he's taken a very active interest in public policy. John, speaking of public policy, I was really struck by your recent testimony to the House Energy and Commerce Committee at a hearing about the Inflation Reduction Act. I should back up and say I think most people know that you got into the business of developing drugs for rare diseases because two of your children were diagnosed with Pompe disease at a time when there was no effective therapy. So you were there, you were testifying along with Steve Potts, a scientist who started companies aimed at treating rare diseases, cancers, and John Swartaki, a multiple sclerosis patient who was in obvious distress. Before any of you spoke, Representative Frank Pallone, the ranking Democrat on the panel, said that no one should pay any attention to what you were saying because the only thing the drug companies care about is making money. And I'm wondering, what do you think about that accusation, and how can the biotech industry operate in an environment in which, frankly, the majority of Americans, Republicans and Democrats, agree with what Pallone said?
Yeah, Steve, first of all, thank you for having me on this week. When I testified a couple of weeks ago before the Energy and Commerce Committee, I think it's important for those of us engaged in public policy in Washington to realize, there are various forums in which you can make your points and have your voice be heard. I've learned over the years that those public hearings do play an important role. I think you go on the record publicly. You are able to bring other people who are stakeholders. So for us, for instance, people living with diseases, entrepreneurs like myself and Steve and others. But you also have to realize that it is a public setting. There is always going to be the drama of political theater. And my skin has gotten pretty thick over the years. So you kind of discount some of those comments. When you get to the substance, though, of what we talked about, to me what was most important, and I think most impactful. What we talked about was, this was the whole purpose of the hearing was to talk about 1 year later, the real world impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act. So a number of us started talking about, why this is not negotiation, why it's government mandated price controls, how it changes the social contract. All of the fundamental things that many of us have talked about, but very specifically, what I asked for is let's focus on a couple of fixes, and maybe we can get more deeply into those. But it was the 9 versus 13 years, the small molecule versus the large molecule, that creates this artificial disincentive that disfavors small molecules, and we need small molecules for a number of different reasons, as you know. And then very specifically to change the orphan provision. I still haven't found anyone in Washington who could tell me how that even got in there, that if you develop a medicine with a second indication, even an orphan designation, you'll lose the price protections that you have, the ability to set that price based on the market. And that's just creates this enormous disincentive toward any of these rare diseases. And it's ultimately going to be the people who are weakest and most vulnerable, these smallest diseases. Remember, all pediatric cancers are by definition rare orphan diseases. So that needed to change. And yeah, the meeting was a little bit overly dramatic at times, but I think the points that were made, I think were really important to go on the record that will enable us to continue the conversation. And we're only going to win this if we really advance this on behalf of patients, let the patient voice be heard.
So, backing up, maybe I do want to talk about the.
Yeah, there was a lot there. I'm sorry, but
I know that's fine.
You asked a big question, I gave you a big answer.
So I want to bore in on a couple of things. So I want to go later and talk about the orphan
Yeah.
part of it. But the big idea of the Inflation Reduction Act, I think for most people, you mentioned the social contract, and most people interpret, I do, the social part of the social contract to be that drug companies develop therapies, they can price them freely for a certain period of time, and then after that period of time, there's going to be generic competition or biosimilar competition that dramatically reduces the price and increases access. And I think that members of Congress look at it and say, well, that social contract hasn't been working in some cases. There are drugs, and frankly, some of the kinds of drugs that you're associated with might be part of that. You know, enzyme replacement therapies, for example, for rare diseases, they may not be subject to biosimilar competition. The companies, in the absence of something like the IRA, may never lower their prices. I'm wondering what you think. I know that you've got a dispute about the timing and the 9 versus 13, but the general idea that something has to be done to address that problem, is that a real problem? Is that something that that legitimately has to be solved?
I think it's a problem in certain cases, in certain disease areas with certain drugs. You'd mentioned, Steve, that we as innovators and drug developers are able to price the medicines freely. We're able to price them at what's hopefully fair and ensures universal access to all patients in need. But we also price them in the context of the market. To me, competition and innovation keep driving forward science, making more medicines, give patients and physicians choices. And again, that should drive that free market system. There have been cases, absolutely. There have been cases where there has been market failure. And individually, then I think the government can address that in very limited ways, or other parties as well. But I think we need to look at the other end of the spectrum, and that's what it takes to make a medicine. And what we just went through with our Pompe medicine, we'll talk in a few minutes about rare disease drug development. But that opening end of the funnel, that needs to change. We need to be able to provide more medicines where it doesn't take 15, 20 years and $1 billion every time we go down this path. And the wild inconsistency that we see oftentimes in the regulatory process. So, I think there are other ways we could address some of the market failures without this broad concept of importing, what are going to be European price controls on medicines, especially all those small molecules where you're only going to get 9 years even after your first indication. That's going to lead, everybody agrees, it's even anybody, Congressional Budget Office, everybody agrees it's going to lead to fewer new medicines. The only debate is how many fewer. And in my view, we should be having more, creating incentives to make more medicines, not fewer.
Well, and it's also not just more or less, it's also what kinds of medicines we're going to get.
And for what diseases, right?
Yeah,
we're going to be developing drugs for diseases where the biology is well understood, where there's large market opportunities. And again, it's going to be the really hard diseases to solve. And it's going to be the rarest of diseases as well that will suffer.
I want to shift back also to some of the things I said at the outset. I mentioned that your kids who are adults now have Pompe disease. That's well known. There's even been a movie made about it. I don't want to intrude on their privacy, certainly, but I was wondering if you could say a little bit about what it's like to develop a therapy like the ones that you've just had approved that's helping your own children and patients, a lot of other patients who you know personally.
But this is why we do it, right? I never intended, I didn't grow up as a kid dressing up as a biotech CEO for Halloween, right? When my dad was a cop, so I was a cop for Halloween. This came to us, and we were determined. First, we were determined to learn everything we could about the disease. When they told us that the kids, Megan was 15 months old, Patrick 7 days old, and told that they would only live to be a couple of years old. And, ultimately we'd settled on determined to learn what we could, and then to try to change the course of that. And it led to, with, the enormous help of a lot of people, some prayer, luck, great science, a first generation medicine in Pompe. After a year or so, we realized that the effects had plateaued. It saved the children's lives, and we were seeing it with other patients as well living with Pompe. While their lives were often saved, the effects were plateauing. And that's usually what happens, right? In drug development, you make a medicine, you extend, enhance people's lives, you give them more time, better quality of life. but it also gives we as innovators a chance to go back to the drawing board and think about, okay, what's next? And that's what led to the founding of Amicus, thinking about for rare genetic diseases, many of those with approved therapies, like in Fabry disease or Pompe disease, what could we do differently? What could we do that would be potentially better? And that's been a long journey now in Pompe. When it works, it's really satisfying.
So, and the thing about that, I think that something that very few people think about who aren't in your shoes, which is that they think, well, it's so difficult to get a drug developed for a rare disease, and it's so important to do that. Once they've done that, it's like, whoa, we've done that, we're done. But it's not, because there's almost no instance in the history of the world where the first drug approved for something is optimal.
Exactly right.
And as you said, for Pompe, the therapy begins to wane, which means that the symptoms progress inexorably, or possibly inexorably.
Almost always they do, yes.
So then, and the thing that I think that people don't understand is that it's extraordinarily difficult. If it's difficult to get the first drug approved, it's even more difficult to get a next generation drug approved. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about what could be done to make that easier, both the first approval and even more the next generation approvals.
No, you're absolutely right. So if you look at Pompe disease, from my kid's diagnosis to the approval of the first generation enzyme replacement therapy, was about 7.5 years. When you look at the time we began looking at second generation approaches, our first approach at Amicus after 4.5 years failed. And we had to go back to the drawing board, come up with an entirely different approach. So all in, this was a 19-year journey and about $1 billion, involved over 1,000 people over time to develop a next generation medicine. It's hard enough in the rare diseases to beat placebo. When you have to show efficacy, equal to, or in our case, we shot very high, superiority to an existing standard of care in a rare disease, that's really hard. And so that's where I think we could really look at the regulatory process and come up with a system that encourages next generation therapies. Again, particularly in a disease like Pompe, where the fundamental biology is very well understood. So when you think about what could be done, novel creative statistics, use of Bayesian statistics, basket trials, there's a whole slew of opportunities to improve the speed and efficacy of clinical trials, keeping the gold standard of safety and efficacy. But we've got to acknowledge that for a lot of these rare diseases where we've applauded in the last 20 years, first generation therapies, we've not had any second generation therapies. Fabry and Pompe, frankly, are outliers. But we need to do better, because you're right. These are important improvements. They're meaningful, but they're not cures. We're never going to be done till we have cures for these diseases.
So one of the things I've heard people talk about is the idea of creating a different standard for very rare diseases. It's something more akin to the emergency use authorization standard that was used to approve COVID drugs, COVID vaccines, and COVID therapies. What do you think about that idea?
Yeah, I think it's one idea worth pursuing, but I think what you need to think about is look at each, we as innovators, patient groups, physicians, and regulators, look at each program uniquely. Look at the molecule, look at its history, look at the biology, look at the disease, the extent of the unmet need. Each molecule, each disease requires a different risk-benefit calculation. Regulators need, though, the tools to be able to exercise that flexibility. Right now, we tell regulators, in rare diseases, you should exercise flexibility, but we don't tell them what that means and when and how to use it. There's some really good people at the FDA, and I think they want better guidance there. So yeah, I think that idea of almost the analogy of the emergency use authorization, I think for many of these diseases could make great sense. It's still like the COVID vaccines requiring a gold standard of safety and efficacy, but flexibility. What we can't do in a lot of these diseases is, roll the dice on one endpoint like we had to do in Pompe on 6-minute walk. Now, ultimately, the regulators, the review division for us was excellent, and they looked at all of the data, and it was very clear and compelling how well the drug works, and that's what the label read. So yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways that we could look at rare disease development, but this whole notion of doing studies tied always to a p-value, and it's never going to work. If that's the standard, we're not going to have nearly as many new rare disease therapies as we need.
Well, thanks, John. We have to take a break now. When we come back, I want to talk more about the IRA, which everybody talks about, and some other topics. We'll be right back. Thank you.
That'd be great. Thank you.
It has been 4 years since most Western executives met with biotech leaders in China. During that time, deal-making between China and the West has increased. China biopharma companies continue to in-license innovation, extending the financial runway of Western biotechs. And now, Western biopharmas are finding innovation in China, helping to fill pipelines. This November, it is time to meet again in Shanghai, at the C-suite level. Join Biocentury, Bay Helix, and Insights partner McKinsey & Company for our 10th China Healthcare Summit. Register today at biocenturychinasummit.com. Can't visit Shanghai? Register instead for an all-digital pass.
I'm back with John Crowley, Executive Chairman of Amicus Therapeutics. John, I said earlier we were going to get back to the IRA, and I do want to do that. And I want to ask you to talk about the single orphan exemption, which I think most people watching this know, but I'll describe it in brief. Basically, Congress said that drugs would be exempt from the price setting in the Inflation Reduction Act if they're designated and approved for one orphan indication. But if they get approval for a second orphan indication, they lose that exemption, which is a very powerful economic incentive for companies to never develop more than one indication per drug. Can you talk about that? And what does it mean for patients, and what does it mean for companies like yours?
Yeah, it's not just a disincentive. Here, I believe Congress just got it wrong. And again, I still haven't had anybody who can very well articulate this for me, why it's there. So I think people need to realize when we do this, let's say you develop a medicine for a rare disease, you get approval under the IRA, you are exempted from the government price control scheme. If you develop a second indication, you lose that exemption. And that could be really damaging for patients who want and need those other indications. And what we need to make sure is that we're providing people as many incentives as possible to develop these medicines, not the disincentives. So I'll give you an example. There's, in muscle diseases that we care a lot about, and Pompe, of course, is a muscle disease. We're always looking at the fundamental biology. How do we address that for each disease? But there's some common pathophysiology in these muscle diseases. We're looking at, other companies are looking at ways in which we can grow muscle, enhance muscle strength. Technology like a myostatin inhibitor that's failed many, many times over many years. It's hard to get that right. But if and when it works, it could be a platform technology for multiple rare diseases. You will create a great disincentive. And what you're going to do is you'll focus on the very largest muscle disease, and all the other rare muscle diseases won't get developed. Likewise, too, when you look at in the oncology space, we often begin with some of the rare indications in cancer. If you then move on later in development, which takes longer and is more complex sometimes, into the broader populations in oncology, you're going to lose that potential to do that without getting put into the government price schemes. So that could be really challenging for people as well. So I think it's something that needs to be fixed. Thankfully, there is a bipartisan bill that was just introduced a few weeks ago to remedy this situation.
So there was a bill introduced. There's a long way to go from getting a bill introduced to getting something actually
very long way, yes.
Passed by Congress. I want to ask you about another technology, which is gene therapy. So Amicus made a big bet on gene therapy for rare diseases in 2018 and 2019, even spinning out to form a new company. And there was talk of a SPAC and creating a new public company and so on. And then you kind of reversed course and said, really, this isn't going to work. Can you talk about that journey a little bit? What got you excited in the first place? And what made you think that this isn't ready now to make it happen?
I go back to when our kids were diagnosed in 1998, Steve. One of the first doctors I called when I was learning everything was developing a gene therapy for Pompe. And I learned about it, never heard about it before. And I asked, when can it be in patients? He said, a year, maybe 2 years. He said, it'll be the standard of care in the next decade. Well, obviously, we know the history of the setbacks that happened then and the disappointments. But It changed for us when I saw the results in the Zolgensma study in spinal muscular atrophy, a disease very similar to Pompe. And I said to our team, I think this is starting to help patients significantly. We need to be involved here. We spent about a year at Amicus. We went under like CDA with more than 20 organizations, universities, other companies. And we acquired one company that had been focused on rare brain diseases, Batten disease, out of Nationwide Children's. And then we did a very significant partnership with Dr. Wilson and his rare disease center, gene therapy center at UPenn. We made great advancements. Our expertise at our company at Amicus is in protein engineering. So we were developing that side of the equation and relying on Jim and others' work on the capsid engineering. As we got deeper into it, we were seeing some of the more advanced results in humans in Batten disease, and then in the preclinical models, certainly in Pompe, a muscle disease where we were using AAV. The therapeutic window is either non-existent or so very tight. And I was worried that we'd trip over, and we're starting to see that in other studies where they were having patient deaths. And so I realized at that point that while it was exciting and someday gene therapies and genetic delivery of material are going to provide more treatments and cures, it wasn't ready, just wasn't ready for prime time. We need to deal with the targeting, the immunogenicity, the manufacturability. All of those problems need to get solved. So we're working on some of them at Amicus. We're looking again back at this universe of technologies being developed. So biotechnology and our entrepreneurs and innovators, our academic centers will get there. It's unfortunately, it's just, I think it's going to take more time. Now, whether that means non-viral delivery, mediated delivery of the genetic material, or something beyond AAV, in some diseases, a select number AAV is appropriate, like we saw with the SMA case. But we still have more work to do.
Well, I want to switch over to another topic. You're the vice chair of bio, which means that you're in line to be the next chair of bio. The recent chairs of bio, Ted Love, Paul Hastings, Jeremy Levin, none of them have been shy about talking about their political affiliations. They're all Democrats. They're all enthusiastic Democrats, right? You're a Republican. And it's really interesting to me because these guys, they all speak very highly of you. They all have complete confidence in your.
I always speak very highly of them. They are great. They are great friends and great Americans.
And they have great confidence in your approach to politics and to public policy issues around biotech. And I'm wondering if you can explain that dynamic. It shouldn't be, but it is uncommon, right? In Washington right now to find people who are on different sides of the aisle politically, who come together and agree about anything.
Well, I think you go back to, we've got a common mission and purpose for each of us individually, for the companies that we've run and founded, and being leaders in the industry organization. And that's really straightforward, right? It's very clear. We're going to make the best medicines we can, encourage this tremendous ecosystem that we have. And it is. And that's something we are all aligned around. And that's the strategic imperative of biotechnology in the United States. And that's because for the public health and making medicines, it's the economic engine that it is, and it's also the national security asset that it is. There, we are all perfectly aligned. We may have some different views on different policies and maybe on the margins on other topics outside of kind of the bio mandate, if you will. And again, when you get into food and agriculture that are such an important part of our mission, there we've got really strong alignment. So we work through, we have very passionate discussions on a lot of these issues, but almost always we reach consensus and find a way to articulate our view on behalf of all the members of bio. And that's exactly what we need to do. I don't want to get too much into broad politics in America, but I think that's ultimately what everybody wants. Have your view, whether progressive, conservative, whatever it may be, and you'll find you'll agree on more things than you don't. And when you disagree, you got to hammer it out.
So what do you think? You've devoted quite a bit of time to bio, and as I said, you're in line to be the chair in a year and a half, I think, something like that. What do you think the role of a trade organization like bio is? Can it make a difference, not just in the kind of day-to-day blocking and tackling on Capitol Hill, but in shaping and improving the public perception of biotech, because I think that's, in essence, that's what really needs to happen to keep the industry viable.
It has to. It has to be our mandate. You think about very simply, what is bio, right? Those words that we use when we talk about feed, fuel, and heal the world, all the different parts of biotechnology. Over the next decade or so, we're going to see a convergence of biotechnologies that will be applicable to human health, but also to food, agriculture, and I think if we're going to solve the climate crisis, it's going to be new breakthrough technologies that do it. I hope many of them come from biotechnology. And we can't just be responsive. We've got to be proactive, but we've got to be bold. We've got a really unique advantage here, Steve, I think, too. And I think if you ask the typical American, what is biotechnology? I think they would struggle to define it. And I don't know many people who would define it as broadly as it really is. So we can work on that narrative and tell our story and tell it through our customers, our patients, everybody in our companies. And once we do that, I think people will appreciate there's a reason that it was biotechnology that saved the world from COVID. And that's exactly what we need to do. So I'm really excited. Ted's leadership is amazing. Rachel King has been just a remarkable leader for bio, a godsend over the last more than a year in moving the organization forward. And that's going to be the mandate for Ted and ultimately, hopefully, for me as chairman going forward. So I'm excited. It gets frustrating at times, for sure. It requires a lot more time in Washington than I ever thought I'd spend. But that's exactly what we need with, for the thousands of biotech companies out there and all the people who need to benefit. It's exactly what's needed. So I assure you, we're not going to be quiet. We've got to be bold.
Great. Well, thanks, John. And thanks for a great conversation. Thanks to all of you for watching.
Yeah, thank you again, Steve. What we do is too important to not succeed. So thanks for the time.
The Biocentury Show is brought to you by the 10th China Healthcare Summit. For a decade, Biocentury, Bay Helix, and Insights partner McKinsey & Company have organized a healthcare summit for biopharma and medtech leaders to discuss cross-border collaboration, investment, and the bridge to innovation in China. For our 10th anniversary, we return to Shanghai to resume in-person networking, live panels, and debate. Join us November 2nd and 3rd for a program designed for C-level executives and investors.